I would like to thank you very much for this opportunity as well to be here today. I'm thrilled to be participating in a population connection webinar. And I was thinking that today, next slide, I'm just going to introduce my work to you a little bit and talk to you about this topic that I'm really passionate about, which is the synergy between reproductive rights, population dynamics, and environmental sustainability. And I came to this to be interested in this topic because I used to be an environmental activist. I used to lead an environmental NGO in Canada. I am based in Canada, by the way. I felt that I was constantly opposing policies. I was opposing shale gas. I was opposing nuclear. I was opposing the extension of pipelines. And I wasn't very much thinking about alternative solutions. And I felt that there was a form of incoherence in the way that in which I lived, what I was advocating for, and the messages that I was sending. And so that kind of led me, and as well as some of the work that I did previously in international development and social work that I did as well, where I could really witness how reproductive rights and the inability of many people across the world, and I'm talking not only about the global south, of course, but also about my home in Canada, how the fact that especially women were unable to control their own reproductive lives, to have and couples didn't have the relevant information and education necessary, led them to a lot of hardship in many ways. And so I felt that there was really an opportunity in thinking about how these sectors interconnected. And that's how I became interested in this topic. So I think it's always important to explain why I came to this topic, because it also showcases some of my values in relation to this work. So today I work both as the director of the FP Earth project, and that's a project that's supported by the Population Institute in the United States, as well as adjunct professor at the University of Ottawa. And I work on these issues, I conduct research on these topics. I'm also doing some, what I would say, activism by participating in a number of international organizations' work trying to influence policymaking. And I also do outreach with students and the media on these issues. So the rationale behind my work is really that by acknowledging the interrelated nature of population dynamics, reproductive rights, and environmental sustainability, we have a very much unique opportunity to advance both movements. And when I say both movements, I refer to reproductive rights and to environmental sustainability. And when I say environmental sustainability, I also include climate change in this environmental umbrella. So I always refer to environmental degradation and climate change as interrelated and interdependent issues, really. So I'm really interested in the fact that by connecting these sectors together, we can reap co-benefits. And that by thinking more holistically, by integrating population dynamics in our reasoning in relation to reproductive rights, as well as in relation to environmental sustainability, we have an opportunity to enhance policy coherence, to make sure that the policies that we put forward, that our various responses are not contradicting each other. And so it's not only advancing policy coherence, but it's also about refraining from engaging into actions that are going to be harmful to each other, and really refraining from policy incoherence. And I'm thinking, for example, about the Sustainable Development Goals that have been criticized because some of the advancing some of the targets of the Sustainable Development Goals would have negative impacts on others, and there hasn't been enough reflection on the interdependent nature, the cross benefits, as well as the feedback loops that exist between these sectors. So this is why I'm interested in this topic, because there's an opportunity to advance reproductive rights. There's an opportunity to advance environmental sustainability. There's also, I mean, more conceptually, philosophically, an opportunity to think in a more coherent way about our situation and about the best response that we should take to our social and environmental challenges. So today what I will do is introduce some of the key concepts that are at stake here. And I apologize if for many of you this will be obvious, but I always feel that it's useful to explain, roughly what are reproductive rights and what are the statistics related to them, as well as what is the link between population dynamics and environmental sustainability, because for some, this is very obvious, but for others, it's not a topic that is well known. So apologies if I talk about things that you already know, but I will introduce the concepts, and then I will present the results of some of the studies that I did in relation to this topic, which should hopefully be more novel for everybody. Okay. Start. So the first key concept that's at stake here is reproductive rights. And I will start with this very obvious statement that reproductive rights are human rights. They're a subset of human rights. They are recognized, they are acknowledged as a proper right in and of itself. But this statement is not as obvious as it sounds. Because reproductive rights are always some of the most, well, I shouldn't say always, but they are some of the most contested rights worldwide. And that is regardless of a population's socioeconomic status, religion, or culture. Wherever you go, reproductive rights tend to be some of the rights that are the most discussed and the most we're conflicted in relation to reproductive rights. Now, there's many reasons for that, of course. They're very personal, they reflect social norms, they're associated with sexuality, etc. But the bottom line is, this is a category of rights, of human rights, that is extremely contested. And every little step that we make in advancing and strengthening them is extremely important. What are reproductive rights? So there's this, I would say the anchor statement for reproductive rights is that all couples and individuals have the basic right to decide freely and responsibly the number, spacing, and timing of their children, and to have the information and means to do so. Now, reproductive rights covers today a much wider set of concepts than just the right to choose how many children we want to have. There's maternal health, there's a whole array of issues that are covered under this umbrella. But here I'm really focusing on this definition of reproductive rights. And so if we look at it, it really encompasses three aspects. One is the freedom, having the freedom to decide, having access to the services that will enable that choice, the education, as well as the education for that. And so reproductive rights, they just, what they are is they include the right to one's reproductive self-determination, the right to these sexual and reproductive health services, education and information, but also the right to equality and non-discrimination. And this is a right that's always attached to human rights. The way in which these rights are unfold should be fair, should be equal. So if we think of reproductive rights in this way, with this very with this very clear definition, I would say that the consequences, how do we interpret them? It means that any condition where a person would be prevented from making a full and informed choice would violate reproductive rights. So that would include, for example, the right to have access to reproductive health services. If we're thinking about contraception, it would mean not just one method of contraception, but having the right to choose among a quality reproductive health services, as well as the full range of options available. So it's a right that these reproductive rights can go very far in terms of what they mean for individuals. They encompass a very broad spectrum of, I mean, it goes very far, and it's not straightforward to provide that. And the reason why I'm explaining this is because as a result of this, it's difficult to fulfill them, and it's easy to understand how far we are from fully having a situation where every person's reproductive rights are met. So if we look at reproductive rights statistic globally, we know that roughly 1 out of 2 pregnancies is unintended. And to me, this is really the starting point for all the work that I'm doing, is that there is so much, the scale of the work that still needs to be done is enormous. So that translates into about 120 million pregnancies a year that are unintended. It doesn't mean that they're unwanted. They may become wanted, but they're unintended at the time at which they happen, for example. Another indicator or statistic that is interesting is the unmet need for contraception or family planning. And that's, there are many estimates, but we know that it's between 200 and 300 million women who have an unmet need for family planning. There's a lot of criticism in relation to this indicator, the unmet need for family planning, because it's far from perfect, and it's also inaccurate on many levels. The way in which we calculate it is not optimal, far from it. But I find I'm not rejecting this indicator altogether. I think that it still provides us with a good idea of scale. The scale of the need is there. The indicator is far from perfect and needs to be revised, and there are new ways to think about this. But the unmet need for contraception is still a useful way to understand quickly the scale of the need in relation to reproductive rights and family planning and contraception in particular. And of course, these statistics, they translate in maternal mortality, morbidity indicators as well. We know that, for example, 25 million unsafe abortions take place every year, and that they result in approximately 47,000 deaths. So there is a clear link between these reproductive rights and public health. We're talking here about public health and about health emergencies in some ways. So my other basic concepts, and apologies again if this is too easy for many of you, but it's looking at the linkage between population dynamics and environmental degradation. It's very clear that a healthy environment contributes to reproductive health and rights. But the reverse is also true, and it's less celebrated as well, that by advancing reproductive health and rights, we benefit indirectly environmental sustainability. And this is something that's very much overlooked, and that is far from celebrated as much as it should be. So here I shared some of the references that really, I think, give the most authoritative evidence for this idea that population dynamics really matter for environmental degradation. even though the impact of population size doesn't determine isn't linear in relation to environmental degradation, it is of course still there, because we all have a set of basic needs that we cannot live without. So everyone has a footprint, whether high or low. And so I would say the key reference that I'm using is the sixth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which identified that population growth and gross domestic product were the strongest drivers of CO2 emissions. There have been many other reports and studies which highlight this interconnection between population dynamics and environmental degradation, and some of them are, I mean, it's quite incredible that we have managed to go only this far in terms of public outreach and integration of these issues in policies, because there have, for example, been warnings by thousands of scientists on climate change who draw attention to the link between population and climate, for example. The Economics of Biodiversity report by Partha Dasgupta is another really key document that really establishes the link between population, the relevance of population size for environmental sustainability, not just climate change, but also environmental sustainability. So if you are interested in learning more specifically about any of these reports or going beyond this, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'll always be happy to respond. So let's go to the next slide. Now, the third element, and then I'll be done with key concepts, is population dynamics in our equation. And so a quick look at global population statistics. We were in 1900 around 1.6 billion humans. We're now at 8 billion. The latest World Population Prospects, which is the most authoritative body issuing demographic projections, estimates that the world is going to grow to 9.7 billion in 2050 and to peak at around 10.4 billion in 2086. So if we're thinking about these numbers in perspective, we're on a pathway to add another 2.4 billion humans in the next couple of decades. And this number, 2.4 billion, is more or less the global population in 1950. So in 1950, we were at 2.5 billion humans. And now from today until 2086, and this is not totally exact because of course there's uncertainty and also the prospects were issued 2 years ago, but we're on track to add another global population of 1950 to what we are today. So the numbers are quite, they speak for themselves, I would say. But the growth rate of the population is declining and fertility globally is going down. So we're in an increasingly polarized world, and this creates for some ambiguity when we're talking about these issues. It makes it less straightforward to talk about the fact, for example, that when I say that population is going to increase by 2.4 billion humans in the next couple of decades. Now, very often people respond to me, yes, but that's not an issue because population fertility is going down everywhere and growth rates are going down. And so there's this kind of ambivalence or almost a contradiction between this growth that's forecasted and the population decline that we hear more and more talk of today. So we know that growth, of course, will be driven by high levels of fertility in some parts of the world, and that growth is already locked in by population momentum in these parts of the world, notably in sub-Saharan Africa. So sub-Saharan Africa is projected to become the most populous region in the world in the late 2060s, with a population that could grow from 1.15 billion in 2022 to 3.44 billion by the end of this century. So if we can contrast that with the populations of Europe and North America, for example, which are projected to grow from 1.1 billion in 2022 to 1.13 billion in 2038. And then they will decline to around 1.0 billion in 2100. So the world is really becoming increasingly demographically polarized, with some parts of the world having stable or declining populations, while others still encounter rapid growth. What's certain is that this rapid population growth and the highest population growth is going to happen disproportionately in low-income countries who are particularly vulnerable to environmental degradation, but not only, of course, they're also particularly vulnerable in terms of their infrastructure, social development, economic, education, etc. All of these sectors the challenges faced are going to be exacerbated by this rapid population growth. So the Population Institute, for example, highlighted that countries with fast-growing populations tend to have a high vulnerability and exposure to the negative impacts of climate change. But there are other projections for future population size, and there's one that I want to mention here, which was issued by a research group in the University. Is it the University of Washington? Yes, I believe it's in the University of Washington. And this group, which was led by Volset, showed that population would peak earlier and at a much lower level if in a specific scenario. And that scenario would be by meeting the Sustainable Development Goal target for contraceptive met need, as well as for education. And that if these two targets were to be met, we would reach a global population of 6.29 billion in 2100, after a peak at 9.7 billion in 2064. So a significantly lower population trajectory by fulfilling education and unmet need for family planning. So we've known that for a long time. I mean, there's nothing really new in what I'm saying, and I suspect that this is obvious for most of you. But having these alternative scenarios written down and modeled by scientists is extremely important, because we overlook the relevance of population dynamics for sustainability, but we also overlook how important reproductive health and rights are, as well as education and gender. But I'm really focusing on reproductive health and rights myself. We overlook their importance for our future. Okay. So this brings me to the work that I'm doing at the FBR's project, and basically I'm continuing a project that was started by Robert Engelman at the World Watch Institute, which was called the FEPESA project, which aimed to really rigorously document the connection between family planning and environmental sustainability. And there was the project was really to gather a group of researchers from around the world to do a massive literature review of the science out there that would make those connections. And one of the reasons I believe for making this project was that it is so difficult to talk about these issues and to have them, to bring them forth in respectable arenas, and in the international development policy sector, as well as in the reproductive health and rights sector, and in the environmental sustainability sectors. There's a reluctance to address population dynamics, and so by seeking these research articles, by seeking to document the science and showing that peer-reviewed articles were addressing these issues and were showing that there was a connection, it was a way to kind of make this conversation more acceptable and acknowledge its science-based focus. And so the FEPESA project, of course, came out with a number of really interesting findings, if I might say. But it's a lit review, so it demonstrated clearly a number of things. For example, that food security is undermined by high fertility, that by fulfilling reproductive health and rights, we expanded opportunities available to women and girls, etc. But of course, it was very difficult to pinpoint, and that was from 2015, this report that it was worked on. It was very difficult to establish the link between family planning and environmental sustainability at that time. I suspect that today it would be much easier. But still, it was I think, a really great attempt at normalizing and making this conversation more acceptable. And so when I did my PhD at the University of Ottawa, when I graduated, I started the FP Earth project, which is kind of a continuation of the FEPESA project. We do a lit review every year. We have a database of literature that's relevant to these issues, and we update it regularly. We conduct outreach, and I continue to do research on these issues as well. So there's two research projects that I want to talk to you about today. The first, I am good, I have a bit of time. The first was the part of my PhD that I conducted, that I finished in 2020. And it was an attempt at documenting what stakeholders from the environmental sustainability movement and stakeholders of the reproductive health and rights movement felt in relation to this nexus between reproductive rights and environmental sustainability, trying to document it to better understand what the perspectives were, because there was such a visible reluctance to address this topic. And this was also, it appeared to me as being an anomaly, that population dynamics were not discussed in reproductive health and rights, even though there was so much to gain for them from that. And so I interviewed about 150, I did a survey with about 150 stakeholders from these movements. I really sought out individuals who were involved in either environmental sustainability or reproductive health and rights. I sent out email invitations, etc. And I tried to do that with a bit of a global perspective, sending invitations across the world. I asked a number of questions related to how they felt that, whether they felt that population dynamics influenced environmental degradation, for example, whether family planning could be considered as a pathway to resilience because of its importance on fertility levels, because of its impact. I asked about whether slowing population growth could play an important role for climate change, etc. I received the results of that study were really mostly that there was overwhelming agreement that population size really mattered, that reproductive health and rights really mattered for environmental sustainability. I mean, there was no ambiguity in relation to that in the results of the study. There was, however, I would say there was clear evidence that environmental sustainability movement stakeholders were more comfortable and were more in favor of integrating the fields of population dynamics, reproductive health and rights, and environmental sustainability than reproductive health and rights stakeholders. So there was more resistance from reproductive health and rights stakeholders to address these issues. But nevertheless, there was overwhelming agreement across both sectors that this was a good idea to integrate population dynamics in both the reproductive health and rights conceptual framework, but also in the environmental sustainability one. There was also, there were a number of participants. There were clearly a minority, but there were a number of participants who were extremely vocal about the fact that they felt very uncomfortable linking reproductive health and rights and population dynamics and environmental sustainability, because they felt that there was two key elements. One, they felt that it would lead to reproductive coercion. They immediately made the link between making this connection and harming reproductive health and rights, really. And then secondly, the other real resistance or reluctance to this idea of integrating these fields came from the fact that the consumption was the biggest concern for environmental sustainability and not population. And that for this reason, talking about population could be considered a distraction, or could be simply, for very few participants, they felt that it was outright a mistake to consider that population had an impact. They felt that population had no impact. So these were clearly vocalized. Another result, and then I'll pass to the next study, was anger. I felt that, so keep in mind that mostly, I mean, the results showed overwhelming agreement for the integration of these topics. But in this minority who was really reluctant to this idea of integrating any collective rights really in the individual rights that are reproductive rights, there was a lot of anger at this idea. It triggered a lot of emotion. And it triggered emotions for those who opposed this, but also for those who were supportive of this idea. I had several conversations with participants, and some of them told me that they felt existential anxiety in relation to this. I'm not talking about eco-anxiety. I'm talking about the anxiety related to the fact that we're not talking about population dynamics. And so there was a lot of, this anger was really a finding of the result, of the study, sorry, as much as other topics. There was, of course, anger in relation to the fact that addressing population dynamics could be considered racist as well. And this kind of led me to my next study, which I finished last year. And that's a study that I conducted with Dr. Owoo, who is a professor at the University of Ghana. She's a professor of economics, but she's also done work on gender, significant amount of work on gender and food security. And together with Dr. Owoo, we decided to embark on a project to document the perspectives of sub-Saharan African policymakers on these issues. And this really came from the previous study that I did, which showed that there was this overwhelming agreement, but that there was this tension in relation to the global south. That for some participants in my previous study, they would say that we were not allowed or in a position to address these issues because we lived in the global north where fertility levels are low. And so if we're talking about fertility levels that are high, we're really targeting the global south, and that for this reason, it could be considered racist to address these issues, etc. Another set of findings that I had from the previous study was I had a couple of sub-Saharan African participants who told me that they wanted to talk about population dynamics, but they felt that they couldn't because their funders were in the global north and were reluctant to address these issues. And so that also really triggered my curiosity. So together with Dr. Owoo, good. Together with Dr. Owoo, we set up a survey and we did in-depth interviews to investigate how sub-Saharan Africans feel about population growth. How do they perceive population growth? How do they perceive the link between population growth and reproductive health and rights? And how do they think that, whether they think that reproductive health and rights and population dynamics have a place in environmental sustainability discussions? So another reason why I was interested in sub-Saharan Africa specifically was, of course, that this part of the world is really a demographic exception. Sub-Saharan Africa has a global average of that's 3 times higher than the rest of the world. So it's in my home country, in Canada, 1.3, but we are at 1.3 births every year in 2022, whereas in sub-Saharan Africa, it's at 4.6. So it's a very, very different landscape. But it's not just that. It's also that historically, the population has increased in sub-Saharan Africa much faster than it has for us. The demographic transition is happening very differently in that part of the world, with challenges that are very different as a result of that, and that are exacerbated because everything happens faster. The growth is happening much faster, but also the fall of fertility is going to happen much faster. And this is where the real challenges lie. When you have these very fast ups and downs, that's where it's extremely difficult for a society to adapt, etc. So from a demographic perspective, sub-Saharan Africa is, of course, very interesting to study, but also from a more social perspective, from the question of gender equity, reproductive health and rights, all these indicators are especially are most dire in sub-Saharan Africa. So the relevance of advancing reproductive health and rights, in one way, I mean, it could be argued that it's the most important in sub-Saharan Africa because there is so much to do there. We're starting from so far. And then looking forward, sub-Saharan Africa is also the continent that appears to be the most vulnerable to environmental degradation and climate change. So as this crisis really unfolds, they're the ones who are going to be at stake in this. Okay, so for that study, we interviewed approximately 18 participants, but we had a survey with over 400 participants from a number of countries across sub-Saharan Africa. We had a number of limitations that were associated with our participant characteristics. We can't claim at all to have generalizability of our results because we had participants that were mostly identifying as men. So we had over 71% of our participants identifying as men. And we also had mostly participants from Ethiopia. 50% of our participants came from Ethiopia. We had nice representation from other countries, but it was really almost anecdotal. Still, we had 400 responses, so we thought of publishing our insights from that study, even though it obviously has limitations. And the participants that we had were they were included in the study if they felt that they were contributing to, if they identified as being an actor in development. It could be social, economic, environmental, any kind of sector, but as long as they felt that they were implicated in some form of development. And so most of our participants came from the health sector, the environment sector, and sexual reproductive health and health, sexual reproductive rights sector. And this is not just coincidences, because we sought participants from those fields. We've spent a lot of time finding organizations and individuals who might be potential participants and extending invitations to them, and then asking them to send out invitations as well. So it was a combination of really targeted invitations, as well as kind of a snowball effect to invite participants. Our findings really echo the previous research that I did on perceptions in relation to reproductive health and rights, population dynamics, and sustainability. What came out very strongly was that there was a deep concern for population growth. Population growth was perceived as an enormous challenge. It was perceived negatively as bringing challenges across sectors. And it was perceived as a transversal issue that really affected everything. An overwhelming majority of participants stressed that we really need to integrate population dynamics in environmental sustainability discussions and in policy making. And from that, we also asked questions about family planning, and if they felt that reproductive health and rights also had their place in environmental sustainability discussions because of their influence on fertility levels. And again, the response was overwhelmingly positive. So I would say that the results were fairly clear. I mean, it was obvious for most participants that this was a key issue, that they wanted to talk about this. And again, quite a few mentioned that they felt that it was difficult to talk about these topics with their funders in the global north. So that's a significant, I find, finding. There was also, of course, mention and concern in relation to the fact that population was, of course, not the only driver of environmental degradation, and that there was concern for sub-Saharan Africa being blamed because of its high fertility level by the global south. And so quite a few participants reflected on this idea of the responsibility for climate change and environmental degradation. And we're very much aware that, of course, it was the global north's consumption habits that really generated this crisis, and that it had kind of and that this would unjustly impact now sub-Saharan Africa. But despite being aware of that and stressing that this was something to keep in mind, that consumption, of course, and technology needed to be addressed at the forefront, this didn't prevent participants from thinking that we also needed to reflect on population dynamics. And that's something that's much more prevalent here in the global north, is to think that, oh, consumption is the real driver of environmental degradation and inequity. So that's what we must address. We don't need to worry about population dynamics. The sub-Saharan African participants were very much saying, okay, consumption needs to be addressed, but we're extremely worried about population growth, and we see firsthand its devastating impacts on the environment. So we want, of course, to work on this on consumption and technology, but also we need to speak about population. So that was I would say, the key finding. And then another important finding is that many of our participants talked about the fact that they felt underrepresented in environmental discourse and policies and forums. They felt that their voice weren't heard enough, either because there wasn't enough research taking place in sub-Saharan Africa, but also because of the difficulties that they had participating in these forums that were exacerbated for many of them. So a crisis of underrepresentation, and also, and this applied also to population dynamics. They felt that their concern about population dynamics wasn't sufficiently heard. So this kind of brings us back to this whole discussion around population and environment being a discussion about equity and justice. And I think that's how we should frame it moving forward. So this kind of brings me to the end of my presentation, but just this picture speaks to some of the work that I'm doing. I'm in there somewhere, but it's me participating as a stakeholder in the work of IPES, and IPES is the equivalent of IPCC, but for biodiversity. So it's a scientific body that talks about biodiversity and lays out. They're the ones making these very big reports for future international reference and guidelines and policies on environment. And I was there as a stakeholder, really to try to draw attention to the importance of reproductive health and rights and population dynamics for these issues. And there was, in this event, there was about 1,000 people. It was very well attended. There were representatives from every country. These were negotiations, discussions. When I was there, they issued the new report on invasive species. You might have heard of it. But when I was there, what struck me was that there was no one else there talking about population dynamics. There was no one else talking specifically about the link between family planning and population dynamics. And I would approach representatives from different countries and talk to them. We would have conversations about biodiversity, and I would start the conversation by saying something like, did you know that almost half of all pregnancies are unintended? And can you imagine what the consequences of this are for biodiversity, etc.? And the responses that I got were extremely positive, and the interest was really great. But there is still no mention clearly of family planning and population dynamics in that sense in IPBES reports. So there's still a lot of work to do. And that's it for me. Sorry for speaking for so long by myself like that.
Oh, thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation, and I personally found it fascinating. I think a lot of our members and people who tuned in did as well. So thank you very much for discussing your research with us and for taking the time today on Earth Day to talk through what you're working on. We've got a few minutes for discussion, and we're not going to get to all of the questions today, but we will follow up via email post lecture here to answer those questions that are left unanswered. The first thing that I would like to ask you, Céline, while I have you here live, is just kind of a broader question about the implications and application of your research. I loved your conversations about looking at and finding the synergy, right, between reproductive rights, environmental sustainability, and population dynamics. And whenever we're able to kind of fuse all of those issues together, we can simultaneously address and help environmental sustainability through the application of an expansion of human rights, right? So it all makes a lot of sense, but there's this intense reluctance to kind of talk about population issues as they relate to the environment, as they relate to CO2 emissions, especially amongst the quote unquote global north. Your research speaks to, you know, the discrepancy here and what's actually going on versus some people's like minority opinions. But how can we apply this? Like what can people say to those who are very reluctant to talk about population, who have this sort of emotionally charged response to integrating population dynamics into conversations about the environment? Or how can this be applied in a more sort of mainstream context?
Yeah, so thank you. That's a really tricky question. Well, not really, but I mean, it's a long one in many ways. I wrote a paper that kind of really speaks to that, and I wrote it with Bob Engelman, that many of you know here. And that paper is called, forgot the exact title, but it's How to Talk About Family Planning and Environmental Sustainability. And I think that there's many principles to keep in mind. One that is dear to me is to take a global approach, not necessarily a national one or a local one, to acknowledge that we live in a very polarized world in terms of demographic trajectories. I mean, I was just in Japan for 6 weeks, where there's where I took pictures the of the fertility decline that's clearly visible in some abandoned villages, and there were islands there with only elderly people living apparently, and so people have very different relations to this topic, and it's important, I think, to keep this step back attitude in relation to this, and have a global perspective on this issue, and acknowledge that this is an issue that we're confronted collectively towards. It's a commons issue, and I think that having a global lens is one good step. Another important step, and I know we don't have much time. Sorry, I was on full screen and I didn't see the time there. But another important step is really to never claim that population is the solution, and that we have to, focus on population, because of course it's a very relative solution, and it's a useless solution if we don't work on consumption and if we don't work on other aspects. So it's really always leading with that and keeping a rights-based focus. It's never about telling people to have fewer children. It's about enabling people to have as many children as they want and educating them about the consequences, the implications of their reproductive choices. But I think that we're in a space where we are today, if we only manage to really enable individuals to fully be in control of their own reproductive lives, will make an enormous step forward. So yeah, these are my three key messages in relation to that.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I guess we have time for one last question. And again, we've got many here, so we'll have to follow up via email with responses to those. But the last thing I'd like to ask is, you were talking a lot about the difference in the pace and kind of structure of industrialization in sub-Saharan Africa in comparison to what's happened to already industrialized countries, and that the population growth rates are falling much more quickly, and things are happening in a way that's, different than what we've previously experienced as a global community. And I'm wondering, from an environmental perspective, if you have much kind of understanding about the effect that climate change is having on the demographic transition for places that are industrializing, in particular that of sub-Saharan Africa, because I think that's something that's also very much impacting and stifling developments in ways that might also influence population dynamics. I know it's also a difficult question because climate change is so unpredictable and geographically specific, but I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to that.
About the industrialization specifically, I don't feel that I'm equipped to talk about that because I don't know much about it. I think that my comment was more about the fact that the demographic transition is going to be experienced differently, not only because of the rate of industrial development, but really because of other sectors as well. I would say that the speed of population growth kind of set up the context for the fastness, the speed of population decline that's going to follow as well. But I was more thinking about things like public health, the advancement of public health in these areas, not necessarily industrialization.
I see. Well, we are right at the hour, so thank you again so much for tuning in and for just expanding and explaining a lot of the research that you've been doing. It's certainly relevant to our work, and we're very happy to get to reference you and to receive the benefits of the work that you're doing. So thank you so much, and thanks everybody for tuning in. Have an amazing Earth Day, and we will see you back here very soon.
Thank you so much, and have a great day. Don't hesitate to get in touch. Thanks.